Dr. Snyder is a composer and jazz musician who lives in Lincoln and teaches at Peru State College. He was born in Chicago, where he studied saxophone with his father, a professional jazz musician. He earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in 1973, while simultaneously publishing original compositions. Dr. Snyder has taught courses in jazz, and this is my new word for the day, ethnomusicology, which he told me means world music, and rock and roll. He is also a member of the Humanities Nebraska Speakers Bureau, and we're just thrilled to have him this morning. We'll get to listen to him till about 9:40 or so. We'll do some question and answer, and you'll enjoy the morning. So, Dr. Snyder.
Even though we have a time slot for the question and answer, I would like to make this very casual, and feel free to ask a question at any time. We want to make this interactive. So if you want me to clarify something, or if I say something that's incorrect, please correct me. Today's presentation is based on one of the lectures that I created when I studied the history of rock and roll at the university. And it's the third in the series of approximately 12 presentations. So the first thing I want to do is to kind of contextualize what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll draw your attention to this flow chart, which is a kind of a bird's eye view of the first 50 years or so of this music that we're going to study. And the basic premise is that prior to 1950, because of segregation and other factors, there was a very separate distinction between black music and white music.
Is it okay to take any camera pictures of these, or?
Of course.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha, thanks.
But then after the Second World War, these boundaries thankfully began to dissipate. And in the mid-1950s, beginning around 1954 and 1955, they came together in a fusion. So on the one hand, we have rhythm and blues, which, by the way, continued in its own separate evolution of soul and funk and rap, African-American genres. And then we have country and Western music coming together. And of course, white music traditions also continue sort of on a separate axis. And so what we're going to talk about today is rock and roll. Now, I am an academic, so you're going to have to pardon me for talking academese a little bit. But the way I'm using the term rock and roll refers specifically to music that was created by white musicians, primarily country musicians who were interested and appreciated the passion and excitement of black music, and began to incorporate certain aspects of rhythm and blues into their material. And two of the main figures, the two individuals that I'm going to talk most about today that accomplished this was Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. Now, after 1960, sometimes people use a blanket term, they just call it rock. Okay? So again, for my purposes, our purposes today, rock and roll is this narrow sliver, really, of about 5 years when this fusion process was accomplished. And then we have the mainstream going down the center. Another way of thinking about this diagram is to imagine looking at the map of the middle part of the United States, where you have on one hand the Missouri River, which starts, I don't know, way off somewhere in Montana, and then it goes all the way down to St. Louis, where it meets the other major river system, which is the Mississippi. And so one historian, Bill Marcus, made this analogy. The two streams meet, hitherto, different streams, they meet forming the main stream. And then we go down to the Delta region of Louisiana, and it branches off into all these different bayous and tributaries. And it's beyond this chart, but if we were to have the next chart, you would see these various branches taking place. So I think that's a kind of useful, simple way of thinking about how this music came together. Now, before we get talking and listening to music, I would like to briefly discuss some social issues, because the fact is that this music really could not have happened had there not been these demographic and sociological processes underway. And the most important is the rise of teenage culture. In a cultural sense, the teenager did not exist until the 1950s. What do I mean by that? Obviously, there were people that lived in their teen years. What I mean is that they went from being a child to a young adult. When they got to be 13, 14, they wore clothes that were miniature versions of what their parents wore. They listened to the same kind of music, basically. Manavani or whatever, Perry Como, out of the big Magnavox in the living room, you see. And then they became a fully fledged adult. There were no commodities, whether it be clothing or food or music, that were specifically aimed at this youth group. This changed in the 1950s when teenagers suddenly acquired an economic clout. With the rise of affluence in the United States, teenagers actually had some money to spend. Here's some examples that I came across. In 1956, there were 13 million teenagers, and they each had an average allowance, weekly allowance of $10.35. Now, you might think that's not very much, but in today's numbers, that's about $100. So they had this money to spend. What are they going to spend it on? Well, they're going to spend it on other things, on the music that they want to listen to. And this also goes along with the invention of the 45 portable record player, which was invented around 1950. So this meant that if the kids got tired of listening to Frank Sinatra, they could go upstairs with their own little machine and play, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley to their heart's content. So that was the fact that we have consumers now, and suddenly musicians are businessmen like anybody else, and they see, here's a chance to make some money. Let's create music that will take advantage of this new economic potential. Now, this also coincides with the explosion of suburbia. The suburbs really began in earnest after World War II, when people had enough money now to realize their dream of moving out of the inner city, out into the outskirts, into more rural, bucolic areas. And one of the motivating factors was the creation of cheap housing, in a sense, kind of prefabricated housing. And entire neighborhoods were developed. The first one was called Levittown. And there was a guy named Levitt who created this sort of standardized, cheap but pleasant little dwelling. Okay. And Levittown began in Long Island in 1946. So suddenly then you have these growing new communities. Now, because you're away from the inner city, there are not bus lines or certainly L's or anything of that nature. So to get around, you had to have a car. You could live in the city without a car. If you lived in New York City, you could take the subway where you want to go. But out in the country, you had to have a car. The kids had to have a car too, because they had to go to high school, right? And every car had, a radio. So a lot of this music was listened to and heard for the first time on the radio. Now, some of the negative aspects of suburbia was suddenly you were uprooted from your ethnic backgrounds. Prior to moving out, you lived in a neighborhood where people were more or less similar ethnic background. You became kind of isolated. You didn't know your neighbors, that sort of thing. And for teenagers, a lot of this created a kind of boredom, a kind of despair that often resulted in crimes that made no sense, like going out and turning over tombstones at a cemetery, or driving by and knocking over mailboxes, which happens at my house every couple of years. This change in the attitude towards some youth was called the generation gap. Well, it was called juvenile delinquency. This was the term that came up. And then later, the lack of communication between the parents and the children was given this title of the generation gap. And some of these are very sensationalized. You see this picture of wild, crazy people. And in looking at this negative aspect from the pillars of the community, they also saw that rock and roll was very much a part of this deterioration, or as they saw it, the decline in Western civilization. Now, films, along with popular music, was very important in giving this new group models, role models, both positive and negative. And there are 3 films that in my class I talk about and play actually excerpts. I just want to briefly mention these today. The first is The Wild Ones. This is a film that came out in 1954, starring Marlon Brando, and it was about a motorcycle gang that came in and took over a town in California, and the police were not able to stop them. They just sort of ran amok for a weekend. And Marlon Brando was this iconic figure dressed in a black leather jacket, right? And tough hoodlum type character. And so after this movie came out, the next day black leather jackets were selling off the hook. Kids wanted to look like Marlon Brando. And in England particularly, a whole movement called the Teddy Boys got started. That was, again, an emulation of this individual. The Beatles started out as Teddy Boys. That was their first look before Brian Epstein said, we want to clean up your act to reach more middle-class listeners. So then they went to the cute outfits for a while. By the way, the motorcycle gang in The Wild Ones, the name of the gang was the Beatles. B-E-E-T-L-E-S. Now, whether that had a factor in the Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S, giving their name, who knows. The iconic line that sums up The Wild Ones, when one of these guys is just going around crazy, some town's girl asks him, what are you rebelling against? And he snarls back, what do you got? This is nihilism. They're opposed to everything. Just bring it on. Now, the second movie is, I think, of the 3, the best movie in terms of film. It's called Rebel Without a Cause. And this was a film that, for the first time, presented in a sympathetic manner the trials and tribulations of being a teen in the United States and growing up. And it starred James Dean. This was his second of only 3 films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and then Giant. And then he died in a motorcycle accident. And here's a picture of James Dean, a brooding image of him. James Dean became the image of cool in the 1950s for a lot of people. Elvis, what he wanted to be more than anything else, more than a rock and roll singer, was an actor like James Dean. Of course, he ended up living his dreams near the end of the 50s with all the movies that he made. This also was one of the first films that presents a sympathetic view of a gay person played by Sal Mineo. So that's a pretty good film. The last film is Blackboard Jungle, and this is a sensational film that stars Glenn Ford as a teacher teaching in a ghetto inner city in Brooklyn. His first day on the job, he gets there, and all these guys are running around with the motorcycle jackets and the switchblades, that sort of thing. Cliches, in other words. What makes this movie interesting in the history of rock and roll is the soundtrack for the film was a film made, I'll jump ahead a little bit later, by Bill Haley and the Comets, called Rock Around the Clock. Rock Around the Clock became the first sort of hit song, big hit song of well, rockabilly, which I'm getting ahead of myself here, which is the transitional phase. Okay. So those three films, each in their own way, addressed, in some cases sympathetically, in other cases not sympathetically, this growing insurgency in a very conservative Eisenhower decade of the 1950s. Now, another key figure in the development of rock and roll were DJs, the role of disc jockeys. And certainly the most famous one is Alan Freed. Alan Freed sometimes is called the father of rock and roll because he was the first to use this phrase in common parlance. But the fact is that the term rock and roll can be traced back at least to the 20s in the lyrics of African American music, with this obvious metaphor of sex involved in the term. But he started out as a DJ in Cleveland, which is perhaps why the Rock and Roll Museum is now located in that city. And he decided to put together one of the first concerts of rock and roll bands in history, really. And this led to the first riot of rock and roll history. What he did was he booked a venue that had about 2,000 seats, and he sold like about 4,000 tickets. So there were a lot of unhappy folks outside. And of course, all of this publicity just increased his standing in the youth community. He later moved his act to New York, where he changed the name of his program from the Moondog Show to the Rock and Roll Show. Moondog was actually the name of the musician. And when Moondog heard about this, he tried to sue Alan Freed. So Freed had to change the name. Freed's most prominence came during a concert in Boston when some bands were playing, and the kids got up spontaneously and started dancing in the aisles, which was forbidden by the authorities. So the police came, they stopped the concert, and they dragged Alan Freed into the paddy wagon. And as he's being dragged in, he says, "Hey, the kids, the cops don't want you to have a good time." So that became his mantra. So he's one of many, many DJs that helped to promote this music. Another very important process that was underway was the rise of the independent record studios. You see here the images of three of the most important of these studios. There's about a dozen or so, but the three biggies are Atlantic Records, which was located in New York City, Sun Studios, which we'll talk quite a bit about soon, and that was located in Memphis, and Chess Records, which was located in the south side of Chicago. And if you look at this listing here, this is a listing of the top 10 rock and roll hits according to Billboard magazine. And you see in 1955, the majors, which we're talking about Columbia Records, RCA Victor, Decca, they had three hit songs in the top 10. The indies had 5. And this disparity only grows as we go through the decade. From 1959, it was 9 to 29. So what happened was, now first of all, why did this happen? It happened because the major labels did not think that this music was any good. But more importantly, they didn't think it would sell. They thought it was a fad, like coonskin hats, or remember the hula hoop, the pet rock, that's my favorite. All of these teenage fads, they thought were just going to come and go. But when they realized that there was gold to be had in the pockets of these kids, they started to turn their attention to making their own version of rock and roll. And this comes along basically in the 1960s, which became a very sanitized, milk toast kind of version of the original, which most historians refer to as pop rock. So pop rock then will be the next major phase in the mainstream of rock after rock and roll. Okay. I want to say that, by the way, that these little studios, they were mom and pop organizations in some cases. And what's interesting is that they each had their own sound because this is before the standardization of recording equipment. For example, Sun Studios had a certain kind of echo effect that Sam Phillips liked. And aficionados of this music can tell just in a few seconds what studio the music was recorded in. Because again, these were all kind of personalized things. And this vanished as we go down history with the standardization of recording equipment and techniques. Now, rockabilly is a term used to describe a transitional phase from some country and western bands beginning to dip into the music of Black America, and this leading them to the mature classic rock and roll around 1956, 57. And the most important band that led in this wave was Bill Haley and the Comets. Bill Haley started out as a country band. They were called the Saddlemen, and they wore the hats and all that kind of stuff. But then he realized, he was sharp enough to realize that this new kind of music that was borrowing now, or stealing, if you will, from this other stream, was the wave of the future. So he changed his name from the Saddlemen to the Comets, which of course is a pun. I hate the Comets, okay. And he made his first recording, Rock Around the Clock. Now, when this recording was released, it was met with mild success. Until about 6 months later, it got picked up by Blackboard Jungle and was chosen then as the theme music when the credits start the film. And because of this selection, it skyrocketed and it went to the top of the charts and became one of the first, if you will, hit songs of rock and roll. Let's listen to a little bit of this here. Now, rockabilly is characterized by an exuberance. They tended to feature fast tempos. They had kind of a nervous energy to it all, because most of the songs that they recorded were covers of songs originally recorded by black artists. And so they wanted to make a distinction between the covers by kind of souping it up a little bit. One other technique, which is very prominent, is the slap bass technique, where instead of plucking it, we're talking about acoustic bass now, instead of just plucking the bass, they would grab the bass, play the note, and then hold the string up and slap against the fingerboard of the bass. So sometimes you hear in rockabilly recordings, there's no drummer, but you hear the slap bass effect, and because it uses a nice kind of percussive quality. Okay. So he had this big hit song, followed up by a few others. See you later, Alligator.
Was there a movie by the same name that he was in with Rock Around the Clock?
Yes. Yeah, that was a film that was made, which included him and several other artists.
Well, as a young well, not even teenager yet, we had free shows in our little town, and that was one of them, and Mon Paquel was the other biggie that I remember. But I remember Rock Around the Clock.
What town was that?
Nahaka. It was in Cass County, down south of Plaza. All the little towns had those free shows. Ours was Wednesday night, and Boca had them another night. I don't know.
Well, one of my older sisters, her first encounter with this music was Rock Around the Clock, and she danced to the record in the house. My mother wasn't too keen on that.
Did you see everyone start to dance when you hit the music?
Yeah, well, tap with our toes.
No dancing in the aisle. Now, technically, that was what we call blues song. That is to say, it was a 12-bar measure song with certain chords, which is the standardized form of black music. Okay, so that's one of the obvious transfers from black music incorporated by country musicians. See You Later, Alligator is very similar in tempo. So he got this one sort of sound in his head, and then they began to mine it with basically copy songs. See You Later, Alligator, after a while, crocodile. Okay. Now, the real figure, in my opinion, the real father of, if you will, of classic rock and roll is Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips was a record producer. He started out in Memphis as a satellite of Chess Records, but then in the early 50s decided to start his own company, and this was Southern Records, one of the major indies that I already talked about. And I must confess, I've never been to Nashville. I've driven through Nashville, but I've never stopped. Has anyone been at this?
Yeah.
Have you? Yeah. So it's still up today, pretty much, like this picture?
I was there about 5 years ago.
Oh, okay.
I assume it's still up.
Right.
It's a major attraction,
Yeah, yeah.
One of the stops.
one of the major attractions in
Yeah.
Memphis.
And you see there on the label, it shows a picture of a rooster in the sunrise.
And they lost that when it went to the 45s.
Oh.
The small holes, fine. 45s, they lost that
Yeah.
because it took the rooster out.
Yeah.
That was a tidbit that I heard in Arizona.
Now, he started out initially recording black artists, and recorded a whole lot of famous people, Howlin' Wolf, etc. One of the most interesting bands that he recorded were the Prisonaires. This was actually a group of inmates at the Tennessee State Penitentiary, and they had a vocal group, a kind of soul group, a gospel group. So he talked the warden into letting the group make a recording, so they came up in a heavily guarded bus. They went and made a recording. Here they are, the Prisonaires. But Phillips was not happy with this because he wanted to really break into a bigger league financially. And so his famous statement was, if I could find, and I'm sort of changing his exact words for political correctness, he said, if I could find a white person that could sing like a black person, I'd make $1 million. So his focus now was on trying to find somebody that would fit the bill. And then in 1953, he happened to be gone from the office when this event occurred. But he told his secretary to make notes of anybody coming in that was interested in recording. And they had a feature that you can go in and make a single acetate record, you know, very cheaply. And so who walks in but this guy named Elvis Presley, who wanted to make a recording for his mother's birthday, for Gladys Presley's birthday. And the song that he sang, and this was not released actually until several years later, was My Happiness. So this is our first introduction to, find it here, to Elvis Presley. We recognize the voice, obviously. And so the secretary wrote down, Elvis Presley, good with ballads, good-looking guy. Right? He was the hunk. But that was it. Phillips comes back and looks over her notes, and not looking for it. So a year goes by, and he decides to give this kid another shot. Now, everybody in the world knows about the history of Elvis Presley, his background. Briefly, he was born in a shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi, to what we would call today lower middle class white family. His father had run-ins with the law occasionally, but mostly the family was dominated by the presence of Gladys. And Elvis was the only child. You probably know that he had a twin brother that died stillborn when his mother had the twins. He wasn't a particularly precocious individual from a musical point of view. He won a medal at a county fair when he was 13, but you know, no great shakes. But then Vernon, the father, said, let's move the family to Memphis for seeking better economic situation. Elvis goes to high school. This is, I think, is a funny story. He got a C in music. And his teacher said, you don't have much a future in music. So he said, okay, I'll become a truck driver. So he becomes a truck driver. Now, the only thing that really separated him from his classmates was his hair was too long. It was longer than normal, right? He was very fascinated by black culture and some of their hairstyles. And he frequented the Beale Street section of Memphis, listening avidly to blues musicians, black musicians. So he began to pick up intuitively this vibe. Now, unlike Buddy Holly, who in a sense was very intellectual about what he did, very conscious about moving things around and recombining things, Elvis was very spontaneous. I don't think that he really thought consciously, I'm going to merge music together, create rock and roll. And 60 years later, the guy's going to give a lecture about what I did. He wasn't that kind of person. He just went with the flow and did what he felt was natural. So Sam said, let's bring him back to the studio for a audition. And to back him up, he used two of his sidemen, Scotty Moore on guitar, lightly amplified guitar, and Bill Black on acoustic bass. And here's a picture of the trio. Elvis played guitar, but he never became much of a guitar player. He could hit a few chords. He mostly used it as a stage prop. So Sam said, well, what do you got, Elvis? So Elvis started singing these ballads because that's what he thought, Sam wanted to hear, Harbor Lights and things like that. And so for an hour they went through these songs, and then Sam said, well, let's take a 5-minute break. And in these 5 minutes, the music changed, the whole universe changed musically, so to speak. Because Elvis decided, just on the spur of the moment, to launch into one of these blues songs that he had picked up in Beale Street. And this was a song called That's All Right, sometimes called That's All Right, Mama. And it was actually recorded earlier by Billy Big Boy Crudup, who was the original singer. But Elvis kind of made his own version of it. So he starts in on this. Phillips hears him, turns around and said, wait a minute, now that's something I'm interested in. So he brought that into the room, and they sat down, and within a few takes, cut the master of That's All Right, Mama. And so the majority, I think, of rock and roll historians will point to this specific moment in time in July 1954 as when rock and roll was born. And let's listen to a little bit of this. Now, after this record was made, or this demo was made, Phillips realized that he had something special. So a day or so later, he took it across town to a DJ whose name was Dewey Phillips. Now, no relation, just coincidence that their names were the same. And he said, Dewey, would you play this for me? Play it on the air. So Dewey played it like in the evening, 10 or 11 o'clock. And as soon as he played it and it was over, the phone rang with somebody saying, who was that? What did you just play? Could you play it again? So he played it a couple of times during his show. And it's hard to imagine this, but Elvis wakes up in the morning, the most talked about musician in Memphis. Here he's a truck driver. He makes this spontaneous recording, and people are saying, who is this guy? And so what Phillips did then was they immediately called the band back to make the flip side. We're talking, the 45 record, A and B side. Each side has about enough for 30 minutes of music. So the second song that he recorded, in my opinion, is even more interesting. It's a cover of Blue Moon of Kentucky, which was an old bluegrass song. And originally it was a 3/4 waltz. It was a very simple waltz that he transformed it into 4/4 time and turned it more into a blues-style song. So in the first song, he takes the blues song and kind of countryfies it. In the second song, he takes a country song or a bluegrass song and makes it much more of a blues-tinged song. So this is more, I think, is a kind of a more interesting transformation. Now listen to his voice. He starts out with this, I can't do it, I'd be embarrassed even to try. These kind of a rhythmic use of his voice, with hiccuping and grunting, all that kind of stuff. And then in the middle, the bridge, he sings with this very clear tenor, almost sweet, like a crooner, like a Bing Crosby. So Elvis displays these two different styles of singing, and Scotty Moore is not given nearly enough credit. He's a guitar player for being this superb, very simple, but very accurate player. He was one of the very first country guitar players to make this transition.
That slap bass is really prevalent too. The
So
slap bass that
yeah,
you were talking
like I said, it
about.
sounds like there's a drummer in the band. But for the first year, only the trio made the recordings. And this was called a string trio, which was a common, acoustic string trio was a common bluegrass or country type of instrumentation. Then later, near the end of his tenure with Sun, he began to use a guitar or a drummer, but very sparingly, sometimes just hitting the rims of the drums, not a heavy presence. So it still remained this kind of pure, kind of acoustic rockabilly, if you will. Now, quickly thereafter, about a month after these recordings were made, Sam got him booked at the Grand Ole Opry, which of course is to country music what Carnegie Hall is to classical music. And it didn't go over well. People were mystified, what's going on? They just couldn't put a label on what kind of music it was. People are comfortable with labels, right? And so that was kind of a misstep, one of the very few in Elvis's early career. Then he went down to Shreveport, Louisiana, and made another appearance on the Louisiana Louisiana Hayride, which was a rival to the Grand Ole Opry, and there he had a big success. Maybe the people down there were more used to this kind of fusion music. Now, one of the very last recordings that he made at Sun Studios is, in my opinion, his greatest recording, maybe of all time, not just of the Sun period. This is called Mystery Train. Now, for this recording, there is a little bit of drum presence, but again, not very much. In particular, listen to how Scotty Moore uses his guitar to suggest the rhythm of a locomotive. This is a great song. So, to me, there's a purity in this music, which could be likened to a classical string quartet, where it's very clear, transparent texture. It's a very delicate music. We think of rock and roll as being always over the top, loud in your face. But these acoustic recordings has a kind of like I say, a kind of pristine quality that a lot of purists will say Elvis's greatest work was done at the very beginning of his career. But then, after these recordings were becoming more popular, a guy by the name of Tom Parker, he called himself a colonel, but he really wasn't a colonel, like Colonel Sanders probably isn't a colonel. And Tom Parker went to Sam and said, I'll buy off his contract for you for $40,000. And Phillips agreed. Now, you might think this is the biggest mistake of his life, but Phillips did this for a lot of reasons. One is he could use the cash, but also he had in the wings Jerry Lee Lewis, a whole bunch of other people, Roy Orbison, that he thought would, Carl Perkins, that would fill the gap left by Elvis leaving. So he took a chance on it. And now Elvis moves from Nashville up the road, or from Memphis up the road to Nashville, and his music completely changed. When he gets to Nashville, his music begins to be produced. Drums are made much more prominent. A backup singing group called Jordanaires began to be used on his recordings. The music became much louder, kind of more commercialized, if you will. So the Sun studio music, we could say most of it would fall into the category of rockabilly. But when we get to this phase, and these are where the majority of his big hit songs can be found. Let's listen to one, Don't Be Cruel. The piano also is used a great deal. So just by the instrumentation alone, you can make a distinction between Sun and... Unfortunately, I'm going to have to rush to get through some of the main points here.
Okay, just a couple minutes left.
Yeah. So he becomes the Elvis Presley that we all know. he buys Graceland, which was not a shotgun house. And he began to gravitate more towards the ballads that he initially sang at the very beginning with Phillips. And began to become more and more interested in films. But before he got to this point, he was drafted. And he had his hair cut, which is a national trauma for a lot of people. But he comes back from the service, and he makes all these movies. Now, whether these movies are good or not is a matter of opinion. But the music that he created for these films were much, much different, much tamer than the earlier music. And so for a lot of historians, Elvis sort of goes out of the picture now as a pioneer, as an avant-garde pathfinder, if you will, and becomes really much more the darling of the conservative, Elvis becoming friends with Nixon and that sort of thing. Now, what I want to do is just mention these, unfortunately, again, time is fleeting here, but Buddy Holly is different than Elvis in many, many ways. First of all, he came from a more upper-class background. He came from a larger family. He was trained in music. He could read music. And he became ultimately one of rock and roll's first great composers of original material. He started out playing in a Western swing band, and then he heard Elvis play live in Lubbock, Texas. This is where he's from. And decided to become a professional musician. He was a backup band for Bill Haley and Comets. And then after an unsuccessful time spent in the Nashville studios, he decided he wanted to start his own company and make music exactly the way that he wanted. So he moved back to Lubbock and found a studio in Clovis, New Mexico, he made a deal with the owner, Norman Petty. He said, I will give you 50% of all royalties that we make, as long as you let me have complete total freedom, creative freedom in the studio. So later, this would kind of haunt him because there's a lot of money that the band made, and he lost a lot of money in that deal. But he did a number of things that were innovative. He popularized the Stratocaster Fender guitar. He was the first, among the first, to use overdubbing, although Les Paul was doing that before him. So he would record a song, and then he would record the harmony parts himself singing, and then sort of stitch them together. He used unusual instruments. For example, in Every Day, there was a Celeste that was in the studio, and the wife of Norman Petty, Vivian Petty, was there. And she said, Buddy, let me play the Celeste. So Buddy let her play the Celeste on the intro. It gave this song a very distinctive, unique quality. There were no other songs at this time that used that particular instrument. And all of these achievements took place in about 2 years. They played at Apollo Theater, the first white band to play. They toured Australia. They were all over the place. And then, sadly, in 1959, the band decided to be part of one of these extravaganza tours which featured a lot of bands. They started out, it was in the winter, started out they played Duluth in February, good luck with that. And they ended up at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa. They played the gig along with other headliners such as Richie Valens and the Big Bopper. After the concert, somebody came up and said, I've got a private airplane, I can fly 3 of you to Fargo, North Dakota. So rather than take a long bus, unheated by the way, bus trip, coins were flipped, and Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens got spots on the plane. The plane took off. The pilot was not really trained to fly in bad weather. A storm came in and they crashed. And, this became known as the day the music died. And just one last thing before we carry on, this was one of the many reasons that people point to the demise of rock and roll. So near the end of the 50s, we had the deaths of these three great artists. Elvis was out of the commission, came back with this lukewarm music. Carl Perkins was in an accident, and so he was out of commission. When he came back, ready to play, his rockabilly style of music was outdated. Jerry Lee Lewis started out great, and then he married his fourth cousin and sort of went south after that. Chuck Berry was riding strong until he was convicted of transporting a minor over state lines, violating the Mann Act, so he was incarcerated for a while. Little Richard was in an airplane, and one of the engines flamed out, and he prayed to God that if he was saved, he'd become a minister. And so Little Richard was out for about 4 years. And a lot of growing opposition from the establishment, and the payola scandal, which was instigated by the major record companies as a way at getting back at the DJs that were promoting the independent labels. And this is when Alan Freed was censured as a result of the payola scandal. So I'm sorry I had to rush. Obviously, we have enough material here for several talks, but thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions or comments?